Karen had always been a dreamer. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she spent countless hours flipping through travel magazines and watching documentaries about faraway places. London was at the top of her list, a city steeped in history, royalty, and charm. For years, it felt like an impossible dream, something she'd only experienced through books or TV screens. But one day, after saving up enough money from her job at the local bakery, Karen decided to take the leap. She booked a ticket to London, packed her bags, and set off on what she hoped would be the adventure of a lifetime. The moment she stepped off the plane, Karen was overwhelmed with excitement. The bustling streets of London were alive with energy. Double-decker buses weaving through traffic, street performers entertaining crowds, and the faint scent of freshly baked scones wafting from nearby cafes. It all felt so magical. On her second day in the city, Karen made her way to Buckingham Palace, the iconic home of the British monarchy. She couldn't believe she was finally standing there, gazing at its grandeur in person. Her camera hung around her neck, ready to capture every detail of this once-in-a-lifetime moment. As she approached the palace gates, Karen noticed the famous Queen's Guards stationed nearby. Their red uniforms and towering bearskin hats made them look almost otherworldly. They stood perfectly still, their expressions unreadable, as if they weren't even human. Tourists gathered around them, snapping photos and giggling at their stoic demeanor. Karen joined the crowd, marveling at how disciplined these guards were. But as she moved closer, something shifted inside her. Karen wasn't exactly known for being calm under pressure. Back in Ohio, her friends often teased her for overreacting to minor situations. Once, she mistook a neighbor's friendly wave for a threatening gesture and ended up calling the police, much to everyone's embarrassment. This tendency to jump to conclusions sometimes got her into trouble, but she usually brushed it off as harmless quirks. Today, however, those instincts would lead her down a path she never saw coming. Standing near the guard, Karen felt a strange unease creep over her. His rigid posture and unblinking gaze unnerved her. When he slowly turned his head toward her, she froze. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a routine movement, nothing more than part of his duty. But to Karen, it felt personal, as though he was singling her out. Her mind raced with questions. Why was he looking at her? Did she do something wrong? Was he going to confront her? Her anxiety spiked as memories of self-defense classes came flooding back. She remembered learning how to protect herself in dangerous situations, including using pepper spray. At the time, she thought carrying it was just a precaution, something sensible travelers did. Now, clutching her oversized purse, she wondered if she'd need it. Her heart pounded louder with each passing second. The guard hadn't moved again, but Karen's imagination ran wild. What if he wasn't just standing there? What if he posed a threat? Without realizing it, Karen began backing away slightly, her fingers brushing against the cold metal canister tucked inside her bag. Doubts swirled in her mind. Should she trust her instincts, or was she overreacting again? Either way, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't leaving anything to chance. Karen's unease only grew as she stood there, frozen in place. The guard hadn't moved an inch since turning his head slightly in her direction, but to Karen, it felt like he was silently watching her every move. Her mind raced with scenarios, each one more alarming than the last. She remembered reading online forums about tourists being scammed or harassed in foreign countries. Was this guard part of some elaborate scheme? Was he trying to intimidate her? The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that something wasn't right. Her eyes darted around nervously, taking in the scene. Other tourists seemed completely unfazed, snapping photos and chatting excitedly. Children giggled as they mimicked the guard's stiff poses, while parents laughed at their antics. To everyone else, this was just another ordinary day at Buckingham Palace, but for Karen, it felt like time had slowed down. Every second stretched on endlessly, amplifying her anxiety. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being singled out. The guard's expression, or lack thereof, was what unnerved her the most. His face was blank, almost robotic, giving no indication of what he might be thinking. Karen had always struggled to read people's emotions, especially when they didn't smile or make eye contact. This guard's stoic demeanor left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. Why is he staring at me? She wondered, her grip tightening on the strap of her purse. Her heart thudded in her chest, and her palms grew clammy. In her panic, Karen's thoughts spiraled further. She recalled a story she'd heard once about someone who got into trouble abroad because they didn't trust their instincts early enough. It was probably just a random tale shared by a stranger online, but it stuck with her all the same. Now, standing near the palace gates, she couldn't help but think back to those self-defense classes she'd taken years ago. The instructor's words echoed in her head. Trust your gut. If something feels off, act quickly. Her fingers fumbled inside her bag, searching for the pepper spray she packed as a precaution. She told herself it was just in case, something to give her peace of mind while traveling alone in a foreign country. At the time, it had seemed like a smart decision, even though she never imagined actually using it. But now, faced with what she perceived as a potential threat, Karen began to second-guess everything. Was this really happening, or was she overreacting? Her breathing quickened as doubt clouded her judgment. Maybe the guard wasn't looking at her at all. Maybe she was misinterpreting his actions. After all, these men were trained professionals whose job was to remain motionless unless necessary. They weren't there to interact with tourists. They were there to protect the palace. Logically, Karen knew this, but logic wasn't winning the battle against her rising fear. Still, the nagging voice in her head refused to quiet down. What if you're wrong? It whispered insistently. What if you wait too long and something bad happens? The thought of regret paralyzed her. If she hesitated and ended up in danger, she'd never forgive herself. On the other hand, acting impulsively could also have consequences. But at least she'd be safe, right? As Karen wrestled with her thoughts, the crowd around her continued to buzz with excitement. No one else seemed to notice her internal struggle. To them, she was just another tourist admiring the iconic palace guards. But inside, Karen was caught in a storm of confusion and fear. Her hand closed tightly around the pepper spray canister, her knuckles white from the tension. She glanced at the guard one last time, trying to convince herself that everything was fine. But the longer she looked, the more certain she became that she needed to do something, anything, to protect herself. Karen's mind was a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and the pressure to act, or not act, was overwhelming. She kept telling herself to calm down, to think rationally, but her instincts screamed louder than reason. The guard hadn't moved again, but his earlier glance still lingered in her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. To Karen, it wasn't just a glance. It was a warning, a sign that something was about to go wrong. And if there was one thing she couldn't stand, it was feeling powerless. Her fingers tightened around the pepper spray canister hidden in her purse. It was small, compact, and easy to miss among the clutter of sunscreen bottles, snacks, and crumpled receipts. But now, it felt like the only thing standing between her and danger. Her heart pounded so loudly, she swore the people nearby could hear it. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, and her vision narrowed as adrenaline coursed through her veins. What if I'm overreacting? She thought again, but the question didn't stop her hand from gripping the canister even tighter. The crowd around her remained oblivious, snapping photos and laughing as if nothing unusual was happening. Children pointed excitedly at the guards, their parents urging them to smile for pictures. Tourists exchanged cheerful greetings, completely unaware of the turmoil brewing inside Karen. To them, this was just another day at Buckingham Palace, a chance to marvel at history and tradition. But for Karen, it felt like the calm before a storm. She tried to rationalize her fears one last time. Maybe the guard wasn't looking at her specifically. Maybe he had simply shifted his gaze for no particular reason. Guards were trained to stay alert after all, and maybe his movement was part of his routine. But these logical explanations did little to ease her mounting anxiety. In her mind, the stakes were too high to ignore. If she hesitated and something bad happened, she'd blame herself forever. Acting now, even if it turned out to be unnecessary, seemed like the safer choice. With trembling hands, Karen pulled the pepper spray halfway out of her bag. Her eyes darted back to the guard, who remained motionless, his face unreadable. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but her body refused to cooperate. Her legs felt like jelly, and her chest tightened with every passing moment. "Just do it," she whispered under her breath, her voice barely audible over the hum of the crowd. "You'll feel better once it's done." Before she could second-guess herself again, Karen stepped forward slightly, raised her arm, and pressed the trigger. A sharp hiss filled the air as a cloud of mist shot toward the guard, enveloping him in an instant. For a split second, everything went quiet. The chatter of tourists, the clicking of cameras, the distant sound of footsteps, all drowned out by the shock of what had just happened. Then, chaos erupted. The guard stumbled backward, his hands flying to his face as tears streamed down his cheeks. His usually stoic expression dissolved into pain and confusion. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people realized what Karen had done. Some shouted in alarm, while others scrambled to get out of the way. Parents shielded their children, pulling them close as murmurs of disbelief spread like wildfire. Cameras that had been aimed at the palace moments ago now focused on Karen, capturing her wide-eyed expression and trembling hands. For Karen, time seemed to freeze. She stood rooted to the spot, staring in horror at the scene unfolding before her. The guard coughed and blinked furiously, struggling to regain his composure. Other guards rushed to his side, shouting orders and calling for help. The once peaceful atmosphere was shattered, replaced by panic and confusion. Karen's heart sank as reality crashed down on her. What had she done? Her initial surge of adrenaline faded, leaving behind a crushing wave of guilt and regret. She hadn't meant to hurt anyone. She truly believed she was protecting herself. But now, surrounded by angry stares and hushed whispers, she realized how wrong she had been. The guard wasn't a threat. He was just doing his job. And in her moment of panic, she had crossed a line she never intended to cross. As the chaos swirled around her, Karen felt like she was trapped in a nightmare. The guard, now doubled over and coughing violently, was being helped by his fellow soldiers who shouted commands and called for medical assistance. Tourists scrambled away from the scene, some shielding their children, while others whipped out their phones to record the unfolding drama. Karen stood frozen, her hand still clutching the pepper spray canister as if it were glued to her palm. Her mind raced, but no thoughts came together coherently, just fragments of panic and disbelief. For a moment, everything seemed surreal. The bright red uniforms of the guards, the gleaming palace gates, even the crisp autumn air, all of it felt distant, as though she were watching the scene through a foggy window. But then reality hit her like a punch to the gut. She saw the guard's face streaked with tears, his body trembling as he struggled to recover from the burning sensation in his eyes. His stoic demeanor was gone, replaced by raw human pain. And she had caused it. Karen's chest tightened as guilt flooded her senses. "What have I done?" she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the commotion. She wanted to run, to disappear into thin air, but her legs refused to move. Instead, she stood there, wide-eyed and trembling, as the weight of her actions settled heavily on her shoulders. People around her began to murmur, their voices tinged with anger and confusion. Some pointed fingers at her, while others simply stared, shaking their heads in disbelief. Her initial fear, the paranoia that had driven her to pull out the pepper spray, now seemed laughably absurd. How could she have mistaken a royal guard, standing perfectly still and minding his own business, as a threat? It wasn't just a mistake. It was a colossal misunderstanding born out of her own insecurities and impulsiveness. Karen felt sick to her stomach as she replayed the incident in her mind. The guard hadn't been staring at her menacingly or planning to harm her. He had simply been doing his job, protecting the palace with quiet dedication, and in one reckless moment, she had shattered that peace. Tears welled up in Karen's eyes as shame washed over her. She wanted to apologize, to drop to her knees, and beg for forgiveness, but the words caught in her throat. What could she possibly say to make this right? "I'm sorry" felt so inadequate, so meaningless compared to the damage she had caused. The guard's colleagues were already ushering him away, their faces stern and unyielding. They didn't look at her, not directly, but she could feel their collective disapproval, a silent wall of judgment closing in around her. The crowd's reaction only made things worse. A few people muttered angrily under their breath, calling her names she couldn't quite hear, but could easily imagine. Others openly glared at her, their expressions a mix of disgust and pity. Some tourists snapped photos of her, not realizing, or perhaps not caring, that they were capturing her most humiliating moment. Karen felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be the center of unwanted attention. Then, amidst the chaos, someone shouted, "Security is coming." The words jolted Karen back to reality. Uniformed officers pushed through the crowd, their authoritative presence commanding immediate silence. Their eyes locked onto Karen, and she knew there was no escape. Her heart sank further as they approached her, their expressions grim. One of them gestured for her to step aside, and though her legs wobbled beneath her, she obeyed without protest. As the officers led her away from the scene, Karen glanced back at the palace gates one last time. The once majestic view now felt tainted, overshadowed by the memory of what had just happened. She had dreamed of visiting London for years, imagining moments of wonder and discovery. Instead, she had created a scene that would haunt her forever. With each step she took away from the palace, the full weight of her regret pressed down on her. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The walk to the security office felt like an eternity for Karen. Flanked by two stern-looking officers, she shuffled along with her head down, avoiding the curious stares of onlookers. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, and every step seemed heavier than the last. The cheerful chatter of tourists and the distant hum of traffic faded into the background. All she could hear was the echo of her own guilt-ridden thoughts. How did I let this happen? She asked herself over and over, but no answer came. When they reached the station, a small, nondescript building near the palace grounds, Karen was ushered inside. The room was plain and functional, with gray walls, a wooden table, and a few chairs scattered around. It smelled faintly of coffee and paper, a stark contrast to the fresh autumn air outside. One of the officers gestured for her to sit, and she complied without hesitation, clutching her hands together tightly in her lap. Her purse, still containing the pepper spray, had been confiscated, leaving her feeling even more exposed and vulnerable. The questioning began almost immediately. A tall officer with sharp features and a no-nonsense tone sat across from her, his notebook ready. "Can you explain what happened back there?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Karen swallowed hard, her throat dry as sandpaper. She wanted to speak, to justify her actions, but the words caught in her throat. How could she possibly explain something she barely understood herself? I thought he was going to hurt me," she finally stammered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to. I swear. I just panicked." The officer raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "You thought a royal guard, a member of the Queen's Guard, was going to harm you," he repeated slowly, as if making sure he'd heard correctly. Karen nodded weakly, tears welling up in her eyes again. "He looked at me," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I got scared. I thought he was staring at me like I was in danger." The officer exchanged glances with his colleague before jotting something down in his notebook. "Do you always carry pepper spray with you?" he asked next. Karen hesitated, unsure how to respond. I brought it because I'm traveling alone," she admitted. "I thought it would make me feel safer. I never imagined I'd actually use it." The room fell silent except for the scratch of the pen against paper. Karen stared at the floor, her mind racing. She knew how absurd her explanation sounded. A royal guard wasn't some random stranger lurking in a dark alley. He was part of a centuries-old tradition, sworn to protect the monarchy. Yet in her moment of panic, none of that had mattered. All she'd seen was a potential threat, and she'd acted on instinct rather than reason. As the interrogation continued, Karen found herself spilling everything. The self-defense classes, the online forums about tourist scams, the stories she'd read about pickpockets targeting unsuspecting travelers. She even mentioned the time she called the police on her neighbor for waving hello. Each detail made her sound more irrational, more out of touch with reality. But she couldn't stop herself. Maybe if she explained enough, they'd understand why she'd done what she did, or at least see that she hadn't meant any harm. By the time the questioning ended, Karen felt emotionally drained. The officers exchanged a few quiet words before one of them left the room, leaving her alone with the other. For several minutes, there was nothing but silence. Karen fidgeted nervously, wondering what would happen next. Would they arrest her, deport her, or worse, charge her with assaulting a royal guard? The possibilities swirled in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. Finally, the remaining officer spoke. "Look," he said, his tone softening slightly. "We'll need to file a report, and there will likely be consequences for your actions. But I want you to know that mistakes can happen, especially when people are scared or confused. What matters now is how you handle this moving forward." His words offered a sliver of hope, but they also carried a weight of responsibility. Karen nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right," she promised, her voice barely above a whisper. For the first time since the incident, Karen allowed herself to take a deep breath. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she realized that apologizing wouldn't be enough. If she truly wanted forgiveness, not just from others, but from herself, she would have to prove that she had learned from her mistake. And so, as she sat in that cold, sterile room, surrounded by reminders of her poor judgment, Karen resolved to turn this moment of regret into an opportunity for growth. News of the incident spread faster than Karen could have imagined. Within hours, headlines blared across newspapers and websites worldwide. American tourist pepper sprays royal guard at Buckingham Palace. Tourist panic leads to attack on historic symbol, and Buckingham blunder. Ohio woman's pepper spray mishap. Social media erupted with reactions, turning Karen's face, captured in blurry photos taken by shocked tourists, into an internet sensation. Memes mocking her actions flooded platforms like Twitter and Instagram, with captions ranging from sarcastic quips to outright ridicule. Back home in Ohio, Karen's life became unrecognizable. Friends and neighbors who had once greeted her warmly now avoided her calls or crossed the street to steer clear of awkward encounters. Local news outlets descended on her quiet town, camping outside her modest house and hounding her family for comments. Reporters knocked on doors, thrust microphones into faces, and broadcast snippets of interviews with anyone willing to talk about the woman who attacked a royal guard. Even her co-workers at the bakery whispered behind her back, their sympathetic glances tinged with discomfort. The backlash was relentless. Strangers online labeled her everything from clueless to reckless, dissecting every detail of the incident with harsh judgment. Some accused her of tarnishing America's reputation abroad, while others mocked her Midwest roots, joking that she must have mistaken the palace gates for a Walmart entrance. The vitriol stung deeply, but what hurt most was knowing they weren't entirely wrong. Karen had acted impulsively, letting fear override reason. Yet seeing herself reduced to a punchline made her feel smaller than ever. Amidst the chaos, however, there were glimmers of humanity. A few people reached out, not to defend her actions, but to remind her that everyone makes mistakes. An elderly neighbor left a note on her doorstep saying, "We're all human. Learn from this and move forward." A distant cousin sent a text urging her not to let public opinion define her worth. These small acts of kindness helped Karen cling to hope during some of her darkest days. Determined to take responsibility, Karen decided to write a heartfelt apology letter. She poured her soul onto the page, addressing both the British monarchy and the affected guard personally. "I am deeply sorry for my actions," she wrote. "I never intended to cause harm or disrespect your role in protecting such an iconic institution. My behavior was driven by fear and misunderstanding, and I will carry the weight of my mistake for the rest of my life. Please know that I am committed to learning from this experience and ensuring it never happens again." To her astonishment, the royal family responded publicly, accepting her apology. In a brief statement, they acknowledged her remorse and encouraged compassion, emphasizing that errors in judgment can happen to anyone. The injured guard also expressed gratitude for her apology, though he chose to remain private and focus on his recovery. Their grace stunned Karen, offering her a lifeline when she needed it most. Inspired by their forgiveness, Karen vowed to turn her shame into purpose. She began volunteering at local community centers, teaching workshops on conflict resolution and cultural awareness. Drawing from her own experience, she urged participants to think critically before acting on fear or assumptions. She shared stories about her trip to London, not to excuse her actions, but to highlight how misunderstandings can spiral out of control. Her honesty resonated with many, particularly young travelers eager to explore the world responsibly. Though the scars of the incident remained, Karen started rebuilding her life piece by piece. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The memory of that fateful day would always linger. But for the first time since stepping off the plane in London, she felt a flicker of peace. This wasn't just about redemption. It was about proving to herself that one poor decision didn't have to define her forever. Years passed, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy for Karen. The initial frenzy surrounding the incident eventually faded, though reminders of it lingered in unexpected ways. Occasionally, someone would recognize her name or face, perhaps from an old news article or meme, and raise an eyebrow. But these moments became fewer and farther between. Still, she carried the weight of what had happened with her every day, not as a burden, but as a constant reminder of how quickly fear and impulsivity could derail even the best intentions. Back in Ohio, Karen channeled her energy into making a positive impact. Her workshops at community centers grew in popularity, drawing not only travelers preparing for their first international trips, but also locals curious about fostering empathy in everyday interactions. She didn't shy away from sharing her story. Instead, she leaned into it, using her mistake as a teaching tool. "I'm living proof that anyone can mess up," she often said during her talks. "But I'm also proof that you can learn from your mistakes and use them to help others." Her sessions were engaging and interactive, blending humor with heartfelt advice. She walked participants through scenarios they might encounter while traveling. Miscommunications due to language barriers, cultural differences, or simply feeling out of place in unfamiliar surroundings. She emphasized the importance of staying calm, asking questions, and trusting instincts without letting paranoia take over. "Fear is natural," she'd say, "but acting on it without thinking can lead to regret. Pause. Breathe. Assess the situation before doing anything drastic." Karen's efforts began to gain recognition beyond her small town. Local newspapers wrote features on her transformation, highlighting her resilience and dedication to helping others avoid similar pitfalls. A regional travel magazine even invited her to contribute an article titled, "Lessons from My Biggest Mistake: Traveling Smarter, Not Harder." Though writing the piece was nerve-wracking, Karen found catharsis in putting her thoughts into words. Readers responded warmly, many thanking her for her honesty and vulnerability. Despite the progress she made, there were still moments when guilt crept back in. Late at night, lying awake in bed, Karen would replay the scene at Buckingham Palace in her mind. The guards' pained expression, the horrified gasps of the crowd, the clicking of cameras capturing her lowest moment. These memories haunted her, but they also motivated her to keep going. Each workshop she led, each person she helped, felt like a step toward redemption, a way to balance the scales. One day, while scrolling through social media, Karen stumbled upon something that took her breath away. A young woman had posted a photo of herself standing outside Buckingham Palace, smiling proudly next to one of the guards. In the caption, she thanked Karen for her workshop, saying it had taught her to approach new experiences with patience and understanding. "Because of you," the post read, "I didn't let my nerves ruin my trip. Thank you for turning your story into something so meaningful." Tears welled up in Karen's eyes as she stared at the screen. For years, she had wondered if her efforts truly mattered, if sharing her embarrassing, painful past could genuinely make a difference. This message was the answer she had been waiting for. It wasn't about erasing her mistake. It was about transforming it into something worthwhile. Though Karen never returned to London, she often dreamed of visiting again someday, not as the panicked tourist she once was, but as someone wiser, more self-aware, and deeply appreciative of second chances. Until then, she continued her work, finding purpose in helping others navigate the complexities of travel and human connection. Every smile, every thank you note, every success story reminded her that even the darkest moments could give rise to light, if only we're brave enough to face them head-on. Years later, Karen found herself sitting on the porch of her modest home in Ohio, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over her quiet neighborhood. It was evenings like these that gave her time to reflect, not just on where she had been, but on how far she had come. Life had taught her many lessons, but none as profound as the one she learned that fateful day in London. The incident at Buckingham Palace remained etched in her memory, not as a source of shame, but as a turning point, a moment that forced her to confront her fears, flaws, and the consequences of her actions. At first, it had felt like a scar that would never heal, a story too painful to revisit. But over time, it became something else entirely, a reminder of resilience, growth, and the power of second chances. Karen often thought about the guard she had inadvertently hurt. She hoped he had moved past it, continuing his duties with pride and dignity. Occasionally, she wondered if he ever thought about her, if he saw her apology letter or heard about the work she did afterward. She liked to imagine that he had forgiven her, even if they never crossed paths again. Her workshops had grown into something bigger than she ever anticipated. What started as small community sessions evolved into a nonprofit organization called Travel with Empathy, which provided resources for travelers to navigate cultural differences and challenging situations abroad. Schools began inviting her to speak to students preparing for study abroad programs, and local libraries hosted her events to packed audiences. People from all walks of life reached out to share how her message resonated with them, how it encouraged them to be more mindful, patient, and compassionate in their own journeys. Karen's transformation wasn't lost on those closest to her either. Her family, who had initially struggled to process the backlash surrounding the incident, now spoke proudly of her achievements. "You turned lemons into lemonade," her mother once joked during a holiday dinner, prompting laughter around the table. Even old friends who had distanced themselves during the height of the controversy eventually reconnected, admitting they admired her courage to rebuild her life after such public scrutiny. Still, Karen knew she wasn't perfect. There were days when self-doubt crept back in, whispering cruel reminders of her past misstep. But instead of letting those thoughts consume her, she channeled them into motivation. Every workshop, every conversation, every act of kindness became an opportunity to prove, to herself and others, that people can change. Mistakes don't define us. What we do afterward does. On this particular evening, as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Karen pulled out an old photo album. Flipping through its pages, she smiled at pictures of her younger self, wide-eyed and full of dreams, standing beside landmarks she had only seen in books. She lingered on a snapshot taken moments before the chaos unfolded at Buckingham Palace. In it, she looked happy, hopeful, and unaware of the storm ahead. Closing the album, she placed it gently on the side table, feeling grateful for the journey that followed. Though Karen never returned to London, she often watched documentaries about the city, marveling at its beauty from afar. She dreamed of visiting again someday, perhaps walking past the palace gates without fear or hesitation. Until then, she carried the lessons she'd learned with her wherever she went. They weren't just reminders of regret, they were tools for understanding, empathy, and connection. As she leaned back in her chair, sipping a cup of tea, Karen realized something important. Life is messy, unpredictable, and sometimes unforgiving. But it's also filled with opportunities to grow, to heal, and to make amends. That day in London may have started as a mistake, but it ended as a gift, one that shaped the person she became. And for that, she was profoundly thankful.